We have Joshua Meltzer here from the Brookings Institution tonight. Joshua is a fellow in the Economic Development program at Brookings, Global Economy and Development. And he has interesting perspectives and a history on this. He was the first trade policy, right, with the Australian embassy before he joined Brookings. So he's been researching, talking, and negotiating on these topics for quite a while, and I think you'll enjoy his observations. Joshua also has a law degree from the University of Michigan, so I think you'll see a similarity in our accents, us both having spent time in Michigan, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Joshua?
Thanks, Bill. And I always thought we sounded quite similar. Thanks for pointing that out. Good evening, everyone, and thank you again to UNLV for having me and giving me this opportunity to make this presentation to you tonight. What I'm going to do in the time allotted to me is I'm going to spend some time giving you an overview of what's happening in the international climate change negotiations. I'm then going to talk briefly about the World Trade Organization. I'm going to assume that none of you spend a lot of your life like I do thinking about this institution. So I'll just give you some basic background information, which I think will usefully inform the rest of the conversation. Then what I want to do is I want to talk about this intersection between the issues that are coming up on the climate change front and the international trade issues that are raised by the climate change negotiations, and also what countries are doing domestically. And then what I want to do is I'm going to focus on what the EU is doing on international aviation, because it's a real live current example of very much this intersection between climate change and trade issues. Before I get into that, I'll just briefly mention some of the key climate change facts as we know them today. And this is just reading off data that the Environmental Protection Agency puts out, and you can go to their website if you want more information. But basically their projections are, there's obviously uncertainty in terms of how severe the impacts will be, but the range is anywhere between 2 and 11 degrees out to 2100, which will be more or less a doubling of warming over the next, say, 100 years than we've seen in the last 100 years. And obviously the impacts are going to be significantly different depending on what part of the country you're from. Here, I like to think actually is quite similar in some climatic respects to Australia, which is also dry in some parts at least and quite arid. And you can expect to see, where you see, for instance, droughts and high temperatures, you can expect to see a lot of this being magnified over time. So, what this means that, for instance, I found this little bit of data quite interesting, that if you, in this part of the country, apparently the average is to get approximately 60 days above 90 degrees, and that's expected to go out to 150 days. So half the year will be above 90 degrees. And in fact, a lot of these days are actually going to be a lot more than 90, like it'll be 100, 110, around that. So that's the type of impact we're talking about. Now before I actually launch into this, I think I need to satisfy some curiosity which might be out there, is what does someone from Washington, DC think about the elections, and particularly what it means for climate change. We in Washington, in this sort of paradoxical way, somewhat do not see a lot of the campaign because no one bothers to campaign in Washington. There are some ads, but it's certainly nothing like what I understand you have been experiencing here. But one thing's clear is that both candidates spoke almost not at all about climate change. I think President Obama, to the extent he spoke about it, speaks about green energy, and really that's sort of become the way that his administration essentially has been speaking about the climate change issue for a while. Now, it's not clear at this stage what's going to happen, at least within the US, on climate change going forward, given Obama's re-election. Certainly, it feels safe to say that to the extent that you think that there should be more action, we're probably in a better position with Obama in than with Romney in. And it's also true to say that while for political reasons there's been no discussion really of climate change in Washington for a couple of years now, quite a bit's actually been happening in the United States. Certainly not enough, but things have been happening. And some of the more important things, which I will just talk about briefly, are what the Environmental Protection Agency has been doing with its regulatory authority to address CO2 emissions from coal-fired power stations. Some of this has actually been specifically directed at CO2 emissions and essentially requires any large source really now to use best available technology to reduce those emissions. But also there's been a variety of regulations which have been getting at some of the other sort of hazardous wastes and air pollutants from coal-fired power plants, which is going to lead to actually the shutting down of quite a significant portion, probably, of the coal fleet over the next 3 to 5 years. And that indirectly is then going to have quite an important impact on CO2 emissions in the United States. There's also been increased fuel efficiency standards, which are actually important. You know, they were initially introduced for light vehicles and now they've also been introduced for heavy duty vehicles, trucks, and coming off a low base, undoubtedly, but over the next 5 to 10 years and further out are going to have a material impact again on CO2 emissions from the transportation sector. So that is progress. Obviously, of course, there's been action at the state level. I mean, close to here, California obviously is introducing a cap and trade system. And as I'm sure you know, California's had a history of being progressive with environmental regulation, and this may be another one of those situations where if California can demonstrate that it can run a cap and trade system well and that it doesn't too negatively affect its economy, that this might become a model for further federal action down the track. But before I think cap and trade ever gets revisited federally, because after the effort in 2009, which obviously ended in significant failure, it's off the political radar, certainly in Washington for the foreseeable future. And what's now being talked about is possibly a carbon tax as part of a broader tax deal, which might include offsetting, for instance, capital gains tax or income tax, so would be possibly revenue neutral, but it would shift the tax burden in a way where you'd be taxing a bad, essentially carbon, and you'd be lowering tax rates on the type of activity that you want to encourage, labour and capital. The other big part of the equation, I think, here in the United States is really what's happening on the energy front, and particularly shale gas. Because, you know, I'm not going to spend time talking about shale gas, and there's probably a lot of people here who spend a lot more time thinking about it, but I just want to make the observation that if you look at the CO2 footprint from gas, it is potentially significantly less than from coal. The jury is out on that because the life cycle analysis is not as clear as that, particularly because there is significant flaring of gas and there's a lot of leakage of methane from pipes. And methane is a lot more serious when it comes to its impact on global warming. These things can all be addressed. They're not technically that difficult, but they need to be addressed in order to make gas a help in reducing US CO2 emissions. And if that actually happens and gas actually starts to back out coal in electricity generation, then gas could be what people talk about as a bridge. So it will give some time to transition away from, say, this heavy reliance on coal into gas and possibly into a lower carbon future down the track. But for that to happen, certain bits of the regulatory framework need to still be in place. But that's another potential in the mix. And the final one is that the Obama administration, partly really as a result of the stimulus bill, has been investing significantly in green energy. And I'll just mention one sort of innovative program, which is ARPA-E, which is Advanced Research Projects Energy, which is being run out of the Department of Energy, which is being modelled on the defence equivalent, which produced the internet. And that's an incubator for sort of step change developments in technology that can sort of disrupt the entire energy base and produce significantly new and different sources of low carbon energy. So that's the domestic front. What I'm going to do now is get into a little bit briefly the international climate change negotiations. And I don't blame anyone for not paying any attention to this, because it is tortuously slow, it is invariably most of the time disappointing, and it is a fairly impenetrable process. So I'm going to give you a brief overview and to give you a sense of where we're up to. Obviously there is the UNFCCC, which is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which the US is a party to, the Kyoto Protocol, a protocol to the UNFCCC, which then set the binding targets, which the US is not a party to, and which essentially finishes at the end of this year. And so part of the discussions has been what happens to the Kyoto Protocol going forward. And we now know that the EU is going to commit to a second period under the Kyoto Protocol. Australia has just recently announced that we'll do the same. There's a couple of other small countries, but more or less, at this stage at least, that's about it. The US definitely not, and possibly Canada, Japan, and other countries that were a party are not interested at all in joining the Kyoto Protocol under conditions where large developing countries like China are not making commitments. I mean, that's basically what's been happening. Now, in the lead up to the Copenhagen meeting in 2009, which you'll recall there was a lot of excitement and energy around that, and which you will recall was largely seen as a failure, did in fact though produce some important though incremental outcomes. And essentially what it did is it shifted the way we think about what the climate change negotiations are going to produce. Whereas under the Kyoto Protocol, what basically happened was that a global target was agreed and countries got together and negotiated what their contribution to that global target was going to be. So countries literally sat around in a room and said, I'll do 4 if you do 5, I'll do 5 if you do 6, etc. So it was a top-down process where the idea was that once you'd actually agreed to a target for your country, you'd then go back, you'd pass the necessary legislation, do what was needed to meet that target. That didn't work that well. The United States, while it signed the Kyoto Protocol, even under President Clinton, it became very clear this was not going to pass the Senate. President Bush, second Bush, basically withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. And countries that had signed it and actually ratified it essentially and had an international commitment under it just didn't meet their targets. Canada was one, Japan was another. What then came out of Copenhagen was more or less a complete change in dynamics. So instead of this top-down process where the international negotiations are going to drive action in countries, countries decided what they're now going to do is bottom up. So they're going to decide separately and individually what they are prepared to do to reduce their CO2 emissions. Then they would reflect this in what's called schedules in a separate agreement. So the United States, for instance, has pledged, this is not a legal commitment, this is really a political commitment to reduce emissions by approximately 17% by 2020. And other developed countries have made their own types of commitments and targets. Importantly, developing countries have also pledged, not necessarily targets, but policies and actions that they will do. So it might be a renewable energy standard, it might be something on deforestation, it might be something on improving the carbon efficiency of different parts of their economy. And why this is important is because the key reason that the United States has refused, well, the key reason that the Senate will never pass something like the Kyoto Protocol is because that there is an unwillingness to commit the United States to a target when countries like China do not have something similar. Now, we won't get into at this stage whether that's fair or not, but that's certainly the view of the US Senate. And this bottom-up process starts to break down what has been a very firm division in the Kyoto Protocol between developed and developing countries. Whereas in the Kyoto Protocol, only developed countries had firm targets. There was really nothing that developing countries were required to do. Importantly also, there was no pathway for developing countries to take on commitments. The other thing to remember is that it's a very different world today than it was in the 1990s when the Kyoto Protocol had been negotiated. Most importantly, China. I'm going to keep coming back to China during this talk. I don't want to paint China as a boogeyman in this whole thing, but it's a useful proxy because it is obviously a very, very large economy, still certainly a developing economy. But the China in the 1990s is not the China today. And the growth of China over those 15 years has changed the strategic calculations around climate change enormously. And the Kyoto Protocol is completely unable to recognise that, which is partly why the United States and other countries, don't want anything to do with it anymore. And it is also partly why this bottom-up process, where now countries like China, while they're not committing to targets, are at least recognising that they're committing to some form of action. And so we're seeing this sharp divide between developed and developing countries slowly break down. Now, since Copenhagen, we've had annual meetings, annual negotiating rounds, which are called COPs, Conferences of the Parties. And we had one in Cancun and Johannesburg. The most important thing really that came out of Johannesburg last year was that there is now a goal to have a legal outcome by 2015 and for that to be implemented by 2020. So that's the time frame we're looking at. Where we're at the moment is if you sum up all the commitments and pledges and targets that countries have made so far, is that we're well short of reaching any type of reasonable global goal for reducing CO2 emissions. I mean, not particularly surprising because what countries are going to have to do is going to be hard and they're not going to do it without a little bit of nudging along. And currently all that is being asked for them is what are they prepared to do voluntarily. So countries are essentially looking at their targets, their sort of business as usual, and they're basically committing to that without having to do much more than that. In addition to the UN process, there's a couple of separate processes. I just will talk about this one briefly. This is called the Major Economies Forum, and it was actually started by President Bush and has been embraced and taken up by Obama. And it basically picks up on the idea that you don't need 190 odd countries to solve this problem. You need the world's 20 largest economies, which are also the world's 20 largest CO2 emitters. You get to about 80 odd % of global emissions. You get them into a room, you force them to sit down and talk through all the really, really hard issues under conditions of strict confidentiality, regular interactions. They build trust in each other, and you try to make progress here. And then that progress might then filter through into what actually happens in the UN process. So these are just some of the countries that are part of this forum. And it has made some progress. I think it's certainly not been anywhere near as successful as people had hoped it would be initially. I think that's partly because a lot of the energy has gone out of the negotiations. And part of the reason for that at the end of the day is that we will unfortunately not get anywhere seriously until the US gets serious about climate change. It still is the fact that the United States is the world's largest and most significant actor, and US leadership on all range of international issues is always key, always. And once the United States gets ambitious and commits to action which is seen as pushing the United States economy onto a trajectory that it needs to get onto, I think we will see in fairly quick succession a whole lot of countries following suit. The other important thing is that in terms of the dynamics of the negotiation, what's really happening at the moment is that China is really probably quite happy with where things are, because until the United States acts, it's very, very hard to expect China to act. So China essentially hides behind the United States at the moment. Inaction by the United States is plenty excuse for inaction by China and basically the developing world more broadly. Once the United States moves, that protection goes. You will see Canada follows very, very quickly, and Japan and other countries will go. And when I say go, I mean they will adopt similar targets and similar levels of ambition, and that will leave the developing world, which is where all the growth now is happening in CO2 emissions. Everyone knows, it's very simple maths, that you cannot solve this problem in any realistic way without getting on board China, India, Brazil, Russia, and a few others. So once the developed world has actually committed to the necessary targets, then all eyes are going to be on getting the developing world to make something serious as well. Okay, the World Trade Organization. So this just sets out basically what it is in very brief terms. It's an international organisation based in Geneva. It is the organisation responsible for trade liberalisation, for the rules of how countries trade and invest and also deal with intellectual property. It provides, in a way, three important functions. One is that it's a forum for negotiations. So most countries have essentially what are called missions. I mean, think of them as embassies in Geneva with essentially negotiating teams that meet daily to do the work of negotiating trade rounds. So currently we're in the Doha round, which is going nowhere, but you know, there's, that's the focus of a lot of what goes on there. There's also, the other part of it is a very important, essentially, international court. I mean, I think it's uncontroversial to say that the international court based in Geneva at the WTO is the most significant international court that exists today, much more significant than the International Court of Justice. It produces regular outcomes. I mean, it is used by countries all the time. Unlike the ICJ, it's compulsory, unlike the ICJ. So by that I mean that countries have the choice of whether or not to litigate before the ICJ. There is no choice at the WTO. Once you become a WTO member, you are committed to the jurisdiction of the WTO's court. The outcomes are legally binding, and even probably as significantly, if you don't comply, the winning country can introduce trade sanctions. So our record on WTO disputes is that countries basically comply with them almost all the time. So, what's it for? Why does it matter? I've just put up the preamble for you because I think the thing just to realise that, well, obviously, the significance about trade is not necessarily trade in and of itself, though there are a lot of benefits to that, but it's obviously a means to an end. And these are some of the ends that it's about: increasing standards of living, full employment, growth in income, production of trade, while protecting the environment and taking developing country needs into account. So this balance of liberalisation, environmental protection, we'll get into a little bit more, but it's certainly there in the preamble. In terms of what the WTO requires of countries, we're not going to talk about that in much detail. I just want to mention a couple of key principles because I'll try to revisit this when I talk about the EU Aviation Directive. But essentially it's about non-discrimination. It's about not treating one country more favourably than another country, the goods from that country. It's also about not treating your own goods, just because they're your own goods, more favourably than imported goods. Discrimination. Reducing trade barriers and really predictability, fair competition, development. It sets the rules of the game. You know, anyone in business knows that one of the key things that businesses want is predictability, right? They want to reduce risk, they want to know what the rules are, and that's exactly what the WTO seeks to provide on an international level. The important thing to also know about the WTO, I think, is that this is not only about tariffs, this is now about, you know, significant ways. The rules reach behind the border and have a lot of impact on how countries regulate in ways that you would not traditionally think have anything to do with trade. I mean, when you think about it, lots of laws, and because we're in a globalised economy, lots of laws and regulations, whether it's about health or environmental safety standards or labelling, can have an impact on trade. And so the WTO actually gets at this issue. It essentially has rules that actually discipline how countries go about doing a lot of this stuff that is not traditionally thought of as trade. So the rules reach deep inside how countries regulate, so it's significantly powerful in that respect. So there are currently 157 members. Russia just recently joined. I've mentioned that it's Geneva-based. I've just put up some figures about the size. It's actually a relatively small organisation, considering what it does and considering what other organisations do. And the current head is Pascal Lamy, and provides a lot of support to the negotiating groups and dispute settlement process. Okay, I'm going to get onto this slide. I'm going to just leave this slide up there, but what I want to do before we talk about aviation is I just want to now talk in slightly broader terms about the potential overlaps between trade and climate change, and then we'll get onto this as a more specific example in a second. So I'm going to broadly classify this out into conflict and cooperation. In terms of conflict, we're seeing actually this happening already. For those of you paying any attention to this, you're beginning to see a lot of litigation at the WTO. So essentially cases being brought to the WTO complaining about how countries are, say for instance, developing their renewable energy sector as being inconsistent with WTO rules. So currently, for instance, there's a case at the WTO where the EU and Japan are challenging Canada's development of its renewable energy sector, its solar energy. The way it's doing that has been WTO inconsistent. China's actually just recently taken a case against the EU, complaining about particular EU rules, feed-in tariffs, about how it develops its solar sector. The US at some point did challenge particular Chinese subsidies to its wind energy sector. So we're seeing that domestic policies which are seeking to build out and promote renewable energy is running into concerns about whether this has been done in a WTO consistent way. So we're getting WTO litigation. Another area where there is conflict which is coming up is actually in the UN climate change negotiations. Now if you're a tradie, you don't want anyone to talk about trade in the UN climate change negotiations, which is kind of seen as being slightly wacky and environmentalist and not really understanding, how things really work. So what's happening is that developing countries in particular are making the claim that the intellectual property rules in the WTO. So the WTO contains standards basically which say this is the minimum intellectual property standard you've got to have, whether it's copyright or patent law, trademarks. And the developing countries are sort of saying, well, part of the deal, part of the climate change deal has always been that you will give us climate change technology to help us reduce our emissions. But we can't get this technology because of these intellectual property standards. This was an argument that was made actually with regards to access to medicines a while ago, and particularly with regards to AIDS medicines in the developing world. And it's being made here. The counter-argument which is being made by the United States and other developed countries is that you need strong intellectual property standards to encourage the type of innovation and the development of the climate change technologies which are going to be required going forward. One area where we're seeing a potential for support, though, is in the reduction of barriers to trade in climate change goods and services. And this is an area which is really undeveloped at the moment. the United States has actually been quite good on this front, and for a number of years now has been seeking to do just this in the WTO in Geneva as part of the Doha round. But it sort of hasn't gone anywhere, partly because the Doha round's gone nowhere. But recently, actually, in APEC, there was some agreement on a list of environmental goods and services and to reduce tariffs, and so that's some progress. But certainly more could be done in that space. The other key issue which comes up, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about here, is this issue of competitiveness and carbon leakage. Now, this issue really actually came up very specifically in Congress in 2009 when the United States was trying to get serious about pricing carbon. And the concern was this: if you put a price on carbon in advance of other countries, which is exactly what was happening, then essentially you're putting a cost on your industry which other industries in other countries are not facing. So then the concern is that those industries are going to be better competitively placed. Their exports to the United States are going to be cheaper, and there's going to be competitive harm. The other concern which is related, which is carbon leakage, is that if then consumers start buying those imports, or if industry relocates to jurisdictions where there is no carbon price, then essentially you will just get CO2 emissions happening somewhere else. So you will get no net reduction in global CO2 emissions, which is what we care about, while you're also harming your domestic industry. Now, the way that Congress proposed to deal with this was two ways. What they were going to do was they were going to essentially give free allowances to what was called energy intensive and trade exposed industry. So if you had a very carbon intensive production process such as aluminium smelting, steel, iron ore, and you were also competitively exposed, so you actually could demonstrate that a certain percentage of the market was already saturated by imports, then you could essentially, the mechanism is free allowances, but essentially think of it as a carve out from the system, so that the carbon price more or less did not apply to your industry, your sector. The other way of doing it, which was also part of the draft bills that were floating around Congress, was what was called a border tax adjustment. And so basically what would happen was you would apply a price on imports at the border to effectively increase the cost of those imports as if they'd been made, as if they'd been subject to the same carbon price domestically, right? So you would neutralise the competitiveness concerns and the carbon leakage concerns. The attractiveness of this proposal, and it was actually quite attractive to environmentalists as well, was that you effectively then also have a bit of an incentive for other countries to act, because the way these things were being drafted was that the carbon tax would only be imposed on imports from countries who were not doing enough, right? Because if two countries are facing the same carbon price, then the competitive concerns wash out, they go away. It's only for those countries that are doing less where the carbon leakage and competitiveness concerns come up. So the idea was that you'd actually have a bit of like a so-called stick and an incentive to be more ambitious, because then you could avoid having your goods subject to this price at the border. So in a way, it was using access to the large US market as a way to incentivise more ambitious climate change action from other countries. Okay, now I'm going to just talk a little bit now about the this aviation, what's going on in aviation, because I think it's a great example of how this issue has really hit the road in a real live way. So, just quickly, I just want to give you an overview of actually the contribution of aviation to CO2 emissions. So you can see that it currently represents about 2.5% of global emissions. but also with significant growth, 3 to 4% annually. And on top of that, aircraft also emit NOx in the ozone, which effectively form into contrails, and they produce, I mean, it's that the white clouds that you see coming out the back of aircraft when they're flying high also magnifies the global warming potential of the aviation sector, which means that taken totally, the impact once you look at NOx and CO2 is actually significant. In fact, some of the latest figures I've seen suggest that if aviation was a country, it would be the 7th largest source of CO2 emissions globally. So what's been going on? So, countries have been very alive to the need to deal with aviation. And in fact, the Kyoto Protocol requires ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Authority, to find a solution to this. So in 2001, ICAO basically called on its members, all the states, to look into this issue. In 2007, they established a group on international aviation climate change, and basically what they came out with was this goal of increasing the fuel efficiency of aircraft annually by 2% out to 2020, and to try to have carbon neutral growth by then. But because aviation is growing at 4 to 5% annually, this was clearly not going to reduce the contribution of aviation to CO2 emissions. And in fact, by 2010, ICAO had more or less recognised this fact itself. But what we see here broadly is that over 10 years, all that we got out of ICAO was an efficiency dividend, which was not enough. So this is an important background because it was really this which led, the EU to act. And what they've done is they've introduced a directive, which is just a law in EU nomenclature, which came into effect on the 1st of January this year. And it effectively includes international aviation now under its cap and trade system. So what this means is that all flights, international, whether they're EU or non-EU, that arriving and departing into EU airspace now have to basically cover their CO2 emissions for the entire duration of the flight. So if you take a flight that is taking off from New York, flying to London, that from, let's say, United Airlines flight, then they are responsible for the CO2 emissions emitted over the United States, over the high seas, and also over EU airspace as they fly and land into Heathrow. There are targets now for the aviation sector, which are 3% this year and 5% annually out to 2020. I'm just going to go through a little bit of detail. This might be too much, but in case for those of you who are interested, a lot of allowances are given away for free, which basically means that in the first year, airlines get most of, for their emissions, essentially 85% already covered. So they really only have to buy 15% worth of allowances to cover their emissions. And this giveaway is tailored off. It's reduced slowly over time, so it's down to 80% in the years 2013 to 2020. And in fact, there are some calculations that the EU is giving away so many allowances for free that the airlines are going to make money out of this. This is not surprising. This is what the EU did when it first introduced its cap and trade system for other industries, and it gave away so many free allowances that there was windfall profits made all across the country. So what do airlines do in this situation? Well, there's a couple of things they can do. They can reduce their CO2 emissions. I mean, obviously, if you've got less CO2 emissions, you need to buy less allowances, and that's where the incentive comes from having a cap and trade system. If they don't do that, they can purchase allowances to cover their CO2 emissions. Now, airlines are going to make that calculation at the end of the day based on the price of an allowance compared to the cost of actually reducing their CO2 emissions. There's also this opportunity to use what are referred to as certified emission reduction units and which are basically part of the Kyoto Protocol structure, which allow for CERs essentially come from what are referred to as clean development mechanism projects, where you do basically a project in a developing country which reduces emissions. You basically get allowances reflecting that reduction in emissions, which can then be used to satisfy your obligations in the EU system. ERUs are very similar. I won't go into the detail, but they happen in the developed world instead. Now, if airlines fail to comply, this is the penalty. So it's €100 per tonne, plus there's the ongoing obligation to comply. So it's quite significant. Obviously, the EU is going to generate some revenues from this, right? Because they're selling at least 15% of the permits. And this is partly a jurisdictional issue in the EU, because the EU can't compel member states in terms of how they use revenues. But what they've done, they've said in the strongest terms the EU really possibly can, that you really should use these revenues for climate change purposes. But there's nothing that actually requires it, because they can't require it. And certainly here in the United States, people have pointed out and said, oh, well, this is just going to be used for budget reduction purposes and the like. Now this is, so what happens when other countries also are regulating aviation? And this is where it gets a little bit interesting, because like what I was mentioning before with how the US was designing its cap and trade system with the border tax, you know, the EU wants to find a way of exempting airlines coming from countries that are also regulating emissions, because the EU certainly is hoping that this system, right, by subjecting all airlines to this charge, will create an incentive for then other airlines to regulate their own aviation sector, instead of it being done effectively by the EU at this stage. Now, the EU sort of, the actual directive says that if another country is doing something which is essentially comparable in effect, then they will exempt airlines from that country. But you know, there's some ambiguity around that, which is what I mentioned here in this possible approaches level, because the way it's actually been, while the preamble talks about equivalent environmental effect, in the actual legally binding part of the law, it doesn't say that. And this has also caused some concern about how the EU is going to manage this. And I'll get into this in a little bit more detail. Now, what's really interesting is how the rest of the world's reacted to this, because it's been, you know, what I would call quite severe. So from the US side, you've had, you know, Secretary of State Clinton, Ray LaHood, who's Secretary of Transportation, coming out and saying, you know, that they strongly object to this, both on legal and policy grounds. You've also, interestingly, had action in Congress where action seemed impossible on anything else. Somehow there was action on this. Nothing's passed, but a bill has passed the House and a bill has passed the Senate. As you know, these bills are slightly different. They've got to be conferenced and eventually passed again, and then signed, obviously, by the President. But without going into the details, basically what these bills do is they make it illegal for US airlines to comply with the EU Aviation Directive, which is quite amazing. Just a little factoid, the only time that the US has made it illegal for US industry to comply with the laws of another country are in the case of the apartheid regime in South Africa and to comply with the Arab boycott of Israel following 1973. So, you know, if you think about the moral equivalence issue, this seems slightly bizarre. But other countries have also come out strongly against it. China has talked about this violation of principle of common but differentiated responsibility, and I'll talk a little bit more about what they mean by that. But you know, a range of other things. But BASIC is basically an acronym for Brazil, South Africa, India and China, which is essentially a grouping in the climate change negotiations. They've come out and expressed strong concern. ICAO itself has issued declarations opposing it. Now, now the key issue here is what countries really don't like is not that they are regulating aviation, but they're regulating non-EU aviation. I think the world would be fairly comfortable if the EU applied this only to EU airlines. What they really don't like is EU applying it to non-EU airlines. There's also been some legal challenges, and I'll just go through this very briefly, but essentially the aviation sector, the United States aviation industry challenged this in the UK, and the way it works in the EU essentially is that any decisions on the consistency of EU law with international law gets decided by the European Court of Justice, and so this was referred to the European Court of Justice, which essentially found in favour of the Aviation Directive on all the key arguments. I'm not going to get into this a little bit more. I actually think this sovereignty issue is an interesting one because it sort of comes up here a bit in the US. We can talk about that in Q&A if anyone's interested. But I want to get back to this carbon leakage and competitiveness issue, which I talked about before, because it helps to explain why did the EU then apply its aviation directive to non-EU airlines. And essentially it had to do it because of carbon leakage competitiveness concerns, the same concerns that existed in the United States when it sought to price carbon. Because airlines are a trade. I mean, it's essentially both a trade and a service. I mean, if you fly on an airline, you are utilising a service that's traded internationally. Airlines also carry cargo, a good, and so the way that you apply cost to airlines also affects trading goods. And there were concerns that if they didn't apply it to non-EU airlines, that you would lead to effectively, the assumption is that this price will flow through to ticket prices and you would harm your EU industry. And it's very easy to switch from flying an EU airline to a non-EU airline. I mean, you get onto orbits.com and with a click of the mouse, you just change your airline. There's also been concern that it would create all these very perverse incentives for if you didn't fly if you didn't include non-EU airlines in the system. And one of them is that, for instance, what it does, and this is one of the challenges also of not having an international approach to this issue, is that because it only applies to the flight into the EU, the incentive now is to fly, say, for instance, to a country close to the EU, fly to Morocco or you fly to Israel, and then you fly to the EU, and then so you're only really then responsible for that last leg of the journey. But that route might actually in the end be longer than a direct route, so you actually might end up with greater CO2 emissions. Now, part of how this is going to play out in terms of competitiveness and carbon leakage is what's the cost going to be? And the costs are not that significant. I've just pulled up some figures here from Merrill Lynch, which suggests that the cost in 2012 will be $2.86 billion, which sounds like a lot, but when you break it down into per passenger ticket numbers, you get $2 per passenger for the budget airlines, $5 for the non-budget mainline airlines, going up to $2.60 and $6. I actually don't have the figures in front of me, but if you break out some of the charges that the United States places on ticket prices, for instance, for security and other reasons, this would come out in the wash. This is minimal. And all you have to do is think about the price of a flight from here to Europe and you realise what a $2 difference is going to make, absolutely nothing. So, how do airlines then reduce their CO2 emissions? I just bring this up because it's useful to think about how the cap and trade system is actually going to work in terms of the incentives that it creates. Certainly, because this is in a way the argument the airline industry is making, which is worth thinking about, because their opposition to it is not just simply commercial sort of myopia. There's already a significant carbon price in the system because fuel is basically the largest cost for airlines. And so Rising fuel prices, which we've all noticed over the last 3 or 4 years, have been significant for the airline industry and has driven significant fuel efficiency increases and will continue to do so. And really the rise in fuel prices that you're getting for other reasons besides carbon will dwarf anything that a carbon price is going to place on airlines for the foreseeable future. Airlines can also increase their load capacities. They can basically put more people on planes, but to anyone who flies, you see the limited opportunities to put more people on planes. The other options are you can switch to biofuels, which is certainly where a lot of R&D effort is underway, both here in the United States and in the EU, but they're not commercially available options at the moment. And another thing which is underway already is switch from basically traffic control using radars to satellite, which will lead to less circling, much more efficient descent paths, and will reduce fuel burn. So I just want to get into how we think about this in terms of what the WTO rules are and what this might mean for the EU. As I said to you, the airlines are both provide a service and they also carry goods, and the WTO rules deal with goods and services. So we have a situation of trade in goods and services, which brings in then commitments that the EU has under the WTO. Now I'm going to talk briefly about how we think about the WTO rules, because we're not going to have a class talk about WTO law at the moment, but I think we can think through this in fairly straightforward terms, because as I said to you at the beginning, really this is about non-discrimination. Don't treat your domestic goods and services more favourable than your imported goods and services. Don't treat the imported goods and services from one country more favourably than those from another country. That's really one of the key principles in the WTO. Now, the EU Aviation Directive applies essentially the same to all airlines. All airlines, when they come into the EU, have to account for their CO2 emissions. There's nothing in the law which specifically says we're going to look after this country better than the other country, or we're going to look after our domestic airlines better than international airlines. But you can also, the other thing about the WTO is you don't only look at what's called this formal discrimination, does the law actually discriminate, but what's the effect of it? How does it actually impact on airlines? And this is called de facto discrimination. I think this is where the trouble comes up. Because certainly it's a case that if you're located further from the EU, you're going to have a greater cost getting to the EU than if you're located closer to the EU. I mean, it's clearly the case that your CO2 emissions increase over distances, and so therefore the costs increase as well. So if you're from New Zealand, flying lamb or whatever you want to fly to the EU, or just as a passenger trying to be a tourist in the EU, is going to be a much more expensive proposition than if you're located somewhere a lot closer, the United States or wherever. The other thing is that obviously within the EU, flights within the EU are obviously going to be a lot cheaper in a way than flights coming from outside the EU. I mean, essentially a flight from France to Germany, from Paris to Berlin, is going to face a much lower CO2 emissions charge than a flight from outside. So we have a problem there. But in the WTO, there are exceptions for environmental laws. And the two key ones here are what are called a measure relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. And we do know from some of the case law that clean air is understood to be an exhaustible natural resource. And also measures for the protection of human, animal, plant life or health can also be allowed. So you can discriminate, but you can do it for these reasons. And we also know that certainly there's going to be an impact on climate change on human, animal, plant life or health. So they might be able to argue that. In order to argue it though, they've got to get through this chapeau. And essentially what this requires is that you can't have arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or disguised restriction on trade. And I don't want to go into the law here, I just want to talk about the policy consequences, because what this means is that in a WTO litigation sense, the EU is going to have to explain a couple of things. First, it's going to have to explain, is a price signal in this case consistent with reducing CO2 emissions? Now, it probably will, but think of this. Studies have demonstrated that and this is just one example, studies have demonstrated that flowers which are grown in parts of Africa, which has a large industry now which grows cut flowers which are then put on planes and flown into Europe. When you look at the CO2 life cycle of that industry, even once those flowers have flown from planes into the EU, it's significantly lower than flowers grown in hothouses in the Netherlands, for instance, and then transported to London for sale, right? But what you're going to do is, with this system, you are going to increase the cost of the flowers from Africa disproportionately more than the flowers from the Netherlands. And because you're really only pricing the transportation leg. And so you might send the inappropriate signal to the market, because if then flowers from Africa become more expensive, right, you end up purchasing more flowers, say for instance from your hothouses in the Netherlands, leading to actually greater CO2 emissions, because the life cycle of these flowers are considerably higher. So this is something that needs to be discussed to actually get through the WTO issue here. And there's also this implication for transit, which I talked about briefly, which is whether it creates these incentives to actually fly less direct routes in order to avoid the system. So I'll just talk briefly about how this has played out in the climate change negotiations, because you know, part of the concern has been that, well, this is all about multilateralism, this has been negotiated, now the EU has behaved unilaterally. And certainly that's true. And it is certainly true that addressing climate change is going to require global action. And the EU has been very, very clear from the beginning that they are only doing this in the absence of global action. And if we can get global action, they're more than happy to suspend the way they're dealing with this and to come on board with an international obligation. Now, it is, you know, the challenge here is obviously that you can't expect countries, while multilateralism is certainly a goal and it's certainly necessary in this context, you can't expect countries to wait around and not act until all countries act, because effectively then you give the countries that are laggards, who are unprepared to act, veto power on what you're prepared to do. And so essentially the EU has then moved forward in this regard. And finally, I'll just finish up with this issue of combat differentiated responsibility, because I mentioned it earlier, and it's been the key concern of developing countries. It's basically the principle in the climate change negotiations that developed countries should do more than developing countries. It's a contested principle, no one quite agrees on what it means, but broadly speaking, that's kind of how it's understood. Now, in the case of the Aviation Directive, the one thing that the developing countries hate is that it basically applies equally to all airlines, whether they come from developed or developing countries. They've all got to reach the same targets in the EU scheme, so it does not differentiate between developed and developing countries. And so the developing countries hate this, partly because they hold fast to this principle in the climate change negotiations, and slippage in the aviation space is possibly seen as slippage in the broader climate change negotiations. So, but then on the other side of the ledger, the US concern is that the EU will buckle and essentially allow countries like China and other developing countries to do less in order to be exempted from the scheme, leaving US airlines facing a higher price. So a vexed situation. So I'm going to leave it at that and open it up to Q&A. Yep.
Yes, very, very interesting talk in so many different aspects, but I'm trying to work on balance and sustainability. And there were a couple of things that came up right at the end of the U.S. campaign that I thought were quite interesting. First was Michael Bloomberg's endorsement, where he listed climate change as the top aspect. And the second thing was when Ross Perot signed on with Mitt Romney. And what I'd like to sort of talk about, and maybe this would actually help in terms of getting the Republican Party, Democrats, and everyone talking, is how to do the trade balancing in a global and balanced way. And I know that the countries that are successful, like Japan, they basically have a thou shalt not. In other words, they won't run trade deficits at all. They work really hard not to run a deficit with China. It's very difficult, but they do it.
Yeah.
So the question is, and it's helpful for all countries to have balanced trade because, that way everyone can rise together.
Yeah.
But I just don't see any specifics for the U.S. But two of the things that I've been toying with, and I'd like your inputs, is I like this idea, which Japan, Germany, and China do, of some percentage, possibly 50%, domestic production of all things that are sold in that country. And the other one, which is kind of like the carbon leakage, is to say, to minimize outsourcing, is to say, if you do the work somewhere else and bring it back, you're going to pay a fee that's based on the number of hours of production times the minimum wage difference, or times the wage differences. So those were, anyway, two ideas.
Thank you. And what I might do is I might collect a few.
On how to balance trade, anyway.
No, great question, and there's a lot in there, and actually, because I know we're sort of running very short on time, I might just collect a few questions and then just answer them all at once. So if anyone else wants to ask a question, yeah.
If it's going from DC to Berlin, the flight, we collect the tax and pay it to Berlin for the flight.
Yeah.
But coming out of Berlin back to DC, DC's not going to collect that money because they're not participating as that country.
Yeah.
Does it get paid to Berlin? Does it get paid to Spain because that's the offshore, or Portugal?
Yeah.
That's the offshore country?
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? No? Okay. I'll answer that quick. So you're liable both in and out, but even though DC is not going to collect it, the airlines are required to hold records for their flights in and out, and then they're going to have to, and so the EU, whoever's collecting it, whichever country, will basically demand them to account for flights in and out. It happens once a year, like there's a true-up essentially annually, and they just look at the total of CO2 emissions on flights in and out. They say you've flown these distances, here's your free allowances, here's what's left over, you've got to purchase or account for it some way, and that's how it's done. And on the trade bit, it's a big conversation. I agree with some of what you say, I don't agree with some of what you say. I mean, we know that in a micro sense, trade balances are driven by the investment savings gap. And so, you can have, there's a literature out there about whether in fact we need to be that concerned about trade balances, because in a way, if you have a floating exchange rate, these things should adjust over time. I don't quite, some of this domestic production issue actually gets to the WTO litigation I was talking about before, because there's a tension here, and the tension is real in the US policy sense, because if the one thing that liberalised trade does is it allows for the most efficient allocation of resources, allows for production of goods and services where they can be done in the cheapest way, and it can therefore allow for, in a renewable energy sense, when we think about that, access to for instance, solar PV or wind turbines being manufactured in places which can do it more cheaply, which makes solar energy then more cheap. It runs into a tension when you then also want to develop your own manufacturing capacity around, say, for instance, green energy, which is certainly, I think, what's happened here in the US. I think there's been a view that green jobs, green energy means manufacturing things here, which maybe the US is just not good at manufacturing anymore. It doesn't mean the US doesn't contribute and actually gain a lot from participating in the life cycle of renewable energy, whether it's at the high-end manufacturing or the services end of the renewable energy spectrum, but it means that a lot of the commoditised parts of the renewable energy manufacturing process probably are going to be done in China and other developing countries, like a lot of the other commoditised manufacturing processes. And so you've got to work out, what do you want? Do you want that, or do you want the type of cheaper access to renewable energy that might come from allowing that to happen? And that's something that sort of needs to be, I think, talked through a bit more. Thank you. Last question?
Going once? Great. Thank you, Joshua, for shedding some light on an important topic. Thank all of you for coming. I'll note we'll have Joshua's lecture, both the video and his PowerPoint, up on our website. Normally, I would say next week, but we have a holiday week, so it might take a little longer, but it will be there in a few days. And we'll gather for our last lecture of the semester, let's see, in almost 2 weeks on the 27th. It's a Tuesday, I believe. Ross Hammond will be out from Brookings, and we'll change the topic to some social issues. Ross is doing some interesting data analysis on health issues, on obesity, on communicable diseases, and he'll talk about how new data studies are being used to affect or not affect policy. So I hope you can join us then. Thank you.